Fake news is not a new phenomenon, although you might think the concept was dreamt up by former US President Donald Trump. His definition of fake news appeared to be real news that he didn't like, i.e. anything critical of him, his family, or his administration. But the truth is, fake news has been around in one form or another for centuries, used by, for and against countries, regimes, politicians and rulers. With a global pandemic, the rise of white supremacy and worldwide protests against police violence against the black communities, we are living in incendiary times where false information, rumours and hoaxes have created what has been described as an infodemic. It's easy, more easy than ever, to introduce a false belief or perception, but once that has gone out, it becomes much harder to change. Sir Winston Churchill is often quoted as saying, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. So, you know, it is quite important that we're able to disseminate fact from fiction. And today's emotions and stress are soaring at an all-time high with the uncertainty around the pandemic. Certainly there are lots of mixed messages out there, and the situation is probably worse in America, where Donald Trump set about inciting hatred and division by saying his political rivals had stolen the US presidential election from him. You know, just let that sink in for a moment. This is was the leader of the free world when he took to the airwaves and to Twitter and to anybody who would listen. You know, he was making the most wild statements and allegations. Most of us today tuning in now will probably have watched with mild amusement. But his false claims caused large numbers among his own supporters to actually believe what he said. And it culminated in the Washington rally and the riots in the Capitol, which cost one policeman and several others their lives. Trump stormed at the time, "The media is the biggest problem we have, and as far as I'm concerned, the single biggest problem, the fake news. We won this election and we won it by a landslide." The truth is, the president was lying. More than 60 different attempts by his legal teams to have all or part of the US presidential election results overturned failed. Not one legal action succeeded, and yet there are still millions of people in America today who think that the election was stolen. Election officials and the Departments of Justice and Homeland Security declared back in November that the process had been fair, and on January the 7th, Congress certified Joe Biden as the president-elect. But Trump's speech and the chaos and violence it incited shows the dangerous cultural, political and human consequences of false information. Experts say while certain factors may make someone more likely to believe false information, we are all actually vulnerable to fake news. It remains to be seen if Trump will be held to account today, but of the 70 million who voted for him, as I say, a large number still believe his narrative. Elsewhere, fake news has been used to start wars. I should know, after my terrifying experience of being captured by the Taliban and held by the regime for 11 days. Ahead of my arrest, I had already formed an opinion that the Taliban was an evil, brutal regime that hated women. Our then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, told the world that this group was so evil that they wouldn't even let children fly kites or let girls go to school. I can now tell you that Mr. Blair was being frugal with the truth. So what was he up to? Well, the rules of war are this. You can't drop bombs on nice people. So you have to spin a few facts, demonize some people, and create the right climate, enabling you to blitz the enemy without incurring the wrath of the people back home, the people who, in most cases, elected Blair to power. So what was the truth about the kite flying? During one of my so-called interrogations, I managed to ask my captors, why have you banned children from flying kites? And they looked at me almost incredulously as I went into detail about Tony Blair's story. And it turned out that they had indeed banned kite flying in towns, cities, and other built-up areas because children were getting too excited and were running across rooftops, flying kites, and they weren't looking where they were going, and they were falling over and having terrible accidents. Others, they said, wrapped their kites around electricity cables, causing power cuts, death, and other injuries. So I said, well, how can you bring down a power cable with something tied to a piece of string? And they started laughing and said that kite flying in their part of the world was quite different to how we perceive kite flying in the West. In Afghanistan, it's more of a combative sport where kites are used to bring down other kites, and the kite line is usually a metal thread or wire dipped in powdered glass, making it razor sharp in aerial fights, and that's how power cables were brought down or snapped. So armed with this new information, I thought about how far I would be able to get up London's Oxford Street during December when all the Christmas decorations are out. And of course, if I tried to fly a kite up Oxford Street, I would probably be arrested or told to stop. And then I thought about the idea, housing estates in the UK, which display no ball signs, no skateboarding, no cycling. And I just thought how you could get these little details and use them against the British Prime Minister. And you could describe him as a man so evil that he won't even let children kick a ball. And that is an example of fake news. So what was the truth about the ban on girls' education? That was another myth, by the way, which is still perpetuated today by the BBC, which many of us regard as the gold standard when it comes to journalism. The day before I was captured, I met a young Afghan woman in her 20s, and through a translator, I asked her about the hopes and fears ahead of the impending war in her country. And she said she was so frustrated because she'd been training to become a doctor and she should be qualified by now and working in a hospital and ready to save lives. But her hopes had been destroyed when she was sent home. And I nodded and said, yes, I'd heard that the Taliban didn't want girls to be educated. But she said her brother had also been training at the same medical school and he had also been sent home because the college had run out of funds and had closed. We often take our free education for granted in the UK and assume all other children have similar opportunities. So that was interesting to hear from young people about how their schools or colleges had closed down. The country had been in the grip of civil war and famine over 2 or 3 decades. So after my own experience in Afghanistan, I actually returned to Kabul in February 2002 to do a radio program for the BBC. And there was great excitement in Kabul at the time because the university was opening its doors for the first time since the war had begun. Britain and America were both keen to promote the idea that they had been involved in a quick win war, and it was all about the liberation of Afghan women. So there was great jubilation when the university opened its doors, and there was a press conference. And while we were there, we were told more girls than boys had passed the entrance exam. So wonderful news. And this is all, you know, the liberation of the Afghan women. And so I stuck my hand up at the press conference, and I said it was wonderful news, but I asked, how could more girls than boys pass the entrance exams when girls were stopped or banned from being educated in Afghanistan? To my dismay, I was shouted down by the organisers, who said this was a day of celebration and they didn't want to discuss negative issues. And none of my other colleagues pushed for an answer. The truth is, there were girls' schools under the Taliban, but the Taliban had insisted on no Western-style curriculums or influence. As the editor of the satirical magazine Private Eye once said, Ian Heslop, he said, it's cheaper to make things up than find things out. So, you know, again, that was back in 2001, 2002, and then at the same time, the drums of war were beating for Iraq, and official briefers from Washington, London and elsewhere were pushing stories demonizing Saddam Hussein. Mind you, he did make the job quite easy. He was a brutal dictator by all accounts. But then stories started coming out with the most lurid details, one of the most famous being the dictator's human shredding machine. And in the run-up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, press stories appeared in Britain and the United States and Australia about this human shredder. One story was written by a British MP, and the headline was, "See men shredded, then say you don't back the war." The Sun's political editor at the time, Trevor Kavanagh, wrote in February 2004 that public opinion swung behind Tony Blair as voters learned how Saddam fed dissidents feet first into industrial shredders. By February 2010, Brendan O'Neill, the first journalist to cast doubt on the story, revisited the subject, writing, "Neither Amnesty International nor Human Rights Watch, in their numerous investigations into human rights abuses in Iraq, had ever heard anyone talking of the human shredding machine." One of the best examples of fake news and the consequences, although, you know, this was a very unpopular war and the Bush and Blair administrations were desperate to get public support behind it, because with wars, very often you need the hearts and minds of the people who elected you into power to be able to go ahead and invade other countries, and there have to be justifications. But as I said right at the start, you know, fake news is nothing new. It's nothing from this century. One of the best examples of fake news and its consequences began with a simple radio broadcast in October 1938. And it's almost unbelievable when you think about it today. But a group of actors performed a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, converting his 40-year-old novel into fake news bulletins describing a Martian invasion of New Jersey. Some listeners mistook these bulletins for the real thing, and they started flooding the police, newspaper offices and radio stations with phone calls, and that triggered a mass panic. There were stampedes in the streets, people jumping into cars. There were even suicides and other mass hysteria as a result of this radio play being broadcast. The original War of the World story, of course, recounts a Martian invasion in early 20th century Britain, and the invaders easily defeat the British Army thanks to their advanced weaponry of heat rays and poisonous black smoke, only to be felled, ironically, by earthly diseases such as the common cold, for which they had no immunity. But the radio listeners in America who tuned in late and missed the opening announcements didn't realize that they were listening to a fictional play. They thought this was real news and that the Martians had invaded. So it seems that there are three kinds of fake news: stories that are entirely invented with the purpose of influencing people into believing something false, or, like Tony Blair's kite flying revelations in Afghanistan, some fake news stories actually contain a grain or two of truth. Again, this can be deliberate to convince people of certain viewpoints. Of course, we also have the myth makers on planet Trump, who will claim that factually accurate stories are fake news just because they don't agree with them. So why are we in the grip of a fake news infodemic at the moment? I think it has reached a critical overload point now because social media platforms have been allowing almost anyone to publish their thoughts or share stories to the world. Of course, now platforms like Twitter and Facebook are trying to roll back. But in many ways, you know, the genie is out of the bottle. I want you to think carefully about this. You know, have you gone on Twitter and retweeted an image or a claim without giving it too much thought? Sometimes it's difficult to check or verify online claims, videos, or images, and before you know it, the tweet or Instagram or Facebook post may have gone viral. In these cases, it's often difficult to track the original source or assess its accuracy. But, you know, it doesn't just happen online. In the good old days before COVID, co-workers would often gather in the toilets or by the coffee machine and spread fake news by passing on misinformation. Quite often this was done inadvertently or without much thought, but the consequences, if you've been at the wrong end of some gossip, can be devastating in terms of reputational damage, not only to people but to products as well. We have to be alert when receiving information from the media or online sources by developing a critical mindset. If the story you read triggers a really rushed emotional response, ask yourself why. Who benefits? Am I being coerced or triggered to go onto another platform or forum to find out more information? While disseminating the information, try and check the source. Is it reliable, tried and tested? I remember paying a small fortune for a face cream because I'd read what I thought was a business article about a glamorous celebrity who was said to have invested in this product. The story was a scam. The newspaper page it was citing had just been thrown together to look like the real thing, but it was pure invention. websites may look authentic and images are easily photoshopped. So it's a real minefield out there. But, you know, if you see a story that really captures your attention, check who else is reporting this story. And if it's an agency like Reuters or Associated Press, then you can be confident that substantial checks will have been made. When you read a news story, it should contain plenty of facts, named sources, and experts. Sadly, some gold standard news outlets have started using unnamed sources or phrases, and I hate doing this, but I'll do it, or phrases like sources close to Downing Street said, or equally other vague qualifications. This is usually a sign of lazy or shoddy journalism. Photographs, again, can be very misleading. You know, what you're seeing with your eyes. Photographs became available to the general public around the mid-19th century and prompted the phrase, "the camera doesn't lie." Well, actually it does, thanks to photoshopping. It can be very easy to create fake images that look real or are used in the wrong context. There are tools available, such as Google reverse image search, to check where an image originated and whether it has been altered. And it's worth checking the site. Admittedly, I've been caught out several times in the past on some websites and stories which turn out to be intentional satire. So if a story gets your attention and then you see that it's originated from The Onion, for example, you know it's satire and it's not true. But I want you to ask yourselves where you get your news from. For instance, people who primarily rely on social media are apparently at increased risk of being hit by fake news. A recent report from the think tank, the Pew Trust, revealed those who rely solely on social media for news are more likely to be exposed to conspiracy theories than those who seek out information on mainstream media, news, websites, cable or network TV, radio and print. And I know it can be very easy to throw your hands up in the air and embrace a bunker mentality, but the good news is that those of you switched on to current affairs are probably in a better position to navigate through the minefield of disinformation. The antidote to the infodemic is this: become more engaged with the news and cast a critical eye over everything you read. The more critical you become, the better are your chances of surviving the infodemic which is out there today. And so I'm hoping that that will have whetted your appetite for more discussion. And I know that Janine was keen for you to be, you know, to actively take part as well. So, you know, I'll now, Janine, throw it back at you and answer any questions, or if I can.
Does anyone have any questions for Yvonne? I don't know if you want to use the raise your hand function, Paul.
Do you think the need for constant information is driving journalism to find stories where there aren't necessarily stories? I think when news was released at certain points throughout the day, they probably had a bit of a pace to it and were finding substantial things, whereas now I can read the same story by the same journalist provider on a day 3 times with a slight update, and you read it and you go, well, nothing's really changed, so why have you put out an update? It just seems to be a constant need to find stuff, and I think that probably has an impact. I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. It's It's true. I mean, the news now is 24/7. Deadlines are by the minute, and news updates. You're right. I mean, I'm a news junkie. You know, it's part of the territory, and to my husband's eternal frustration, if I had a chance, I would permanently have a news network on, so I can see the news changing, and he'll say, it's the same old story, why are you watching it? But something might happen, and there's that feeling that, you know, you might miss something important that's going to happen, and so some of us are hooked onto news, and unfortunately, you know, the 24/7 nature of news gathering now, I'm not sure that it is healthy, and the Twitter, for instance, you know, if there's a major incident happening and you go onto Twitter and then somebody says, yes, 10 people have died, and then you retweet that, and somebody else is saying, oh, it's 5, or it's, you know, and unfortunately, you know, many of us are guilty of inadvertently spreading false news. And so how do we overcome that? It's a difficult question. We do need to be more discerning, I think. And I noticed that Twitter have now put a new thing on, and if you heart something, you know, that a story, that's fine. But if you then retweet it and you haven't necessarily read the story, a little message will come up, do you want to retweet this, without reading it? And then you sort of pull yourself back and think, well, I've seen the headline, or I more or less know what this is about, but actually I should read the story first. So, you know, as well as policing others, I think we need to police ourselves. But I'm not sure what we can do about this concept of 24/7 news. Because, you know, you're right, the same journalist can write about the same incident, and it very little changes, which must be a turn-off for the reader as well.
Thank you. Joe, you were next.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you for that, Yvonne. Really interesting. I'm on the edge of my seat here. There's so much I want to say. So many questions. So, but mine's going to relate back to, you know, you were talking about social media being the source of much fake news, fake stories with maybe a grain of truth, and I feel that the younger generations, actually, this is where they get their news from. This is the news source for them. They're not going to watch the news at 10. You know, typically they're in the room picking it up from social media. And not only does that spread fake news and false concepts, it also impacts their mental health really significantly. So I think there's I don't know if it's a moral dilemma, a political dilemma, I'm not sure, but it raises a question of censorship, and actually that removes our freedom of speech. But it feels like it's so damaging that actually censorship should be on the agenda. So yeah, your comments. Sorry, it's not really a question, more observation, but yeah, wondering what you think to that.
It's you know, somebody contacted me last year and said her grandson was interested in journalism, and she said, you know, would you meet him and have a chat with him? And so I did, and there was this young man, 17 or 18, and we were sitting there. He had his head down most of the time with his phone, and he sort of, you know, and I don't know if it's that kids are multitasking, whether we should be in admiration of them, or just think how bad mannered you are, put the bloody phone down and listen to it. And one of the questions I said to him, so what newspapers do you read? And he sort of looked at me and started laughing. And he said, no one reads newspapers these days. And I just thought, actually, he's right. You know, there is this new generation, and this is their sort of Bible. You know, this is where they get their information from. And I'm wondering, maybe it's something that maybe should be taught in schools, you know, how to access news, how to access information, how to make sure it's reliable. Because, you know, we can't confiscate phones. We can't stop them from using their phones. But we can maybe influence them in how they disseminate information. And I just think that technology is just racing ahead so fast that we're struggling as parents, as teachers, as innovators to work out the best way of passing this information on to the next generation. I mean, it's incredible when you think, actually, I'm probably the oldest one here, but, you know, I started off with a typewriter. There wasn't any technology around. And although I have to say, the advantage of working with a typewriter is I never lost a 1,000-word article on the typewriter. You know, I'm sure that you've all seen things disappear from your screen and you go, my goodness. I think that technology is moving so fast, we're struggling to keep up with it. And so, you know, this is something, again, through education that we need to get on top of.
That's kind of a good point to go to Dan's question in the chat. I know you mentioned earlier that the BBC are supposed to be the gold standard, and you said they also sometimes are not that reliable. So Dan had a question in the chat. What's the best and most reliable source of news, in your opinion?
I think that if you've got the time, you know, pick 2 or 3 sources for your information. The BBC is still does a good job on the whole. So, you know, if you see a story that you engage with on the BBC, check the version in 2 other sources as well. And you know, even if there are sources that you think, gosh, they're too right for me or too left for me, if you get a good broad church of information, you should then be in a position to form your own mind about what is happening and about information. I think it's a sad indictment on journalism today that, you know, you can't pick up one piece of newspaper or TV or radio and say, right, I've heard it from them, I don't need to look anywhere else. You know, we all have to become our own researchers, really.
Right, I think we'll have one more. Sorry, Paul, we're going to go into breakout rooms in a minute. So, Matt, what was your question?
So I think you've kind of answered some of it in Joe's question. It was really around where the responsibility sits for censorship. So I think with Mr. Trump finally being silenced, most of the civilized world breathes a sigh of relief. But where does that responsibility sit? Do you think that as a world we should have acted sooner to mute the things he said, because they were so damaging and ill considered?
Well, it took Twitter 4 years to finally silence him and other media platforms, and he'd done a lot of damage in the meantime. And unfortunately, I said 70 million people voted for him, and more than 50% still believe that the election was stolen. And there's no way of pacifying these people, because they've relied on the word of Donald Trump for their information. They've then got information from other right-wing or right-leaning websites. They're talking amongst themselves and talking up the theft of the election. And when you try and engage them on the social networks and say, well, actually CNN said this, oh, that's fake news. Well, the BBC said, oh, that's fake news. And they just refuse to accept the other narrative. And this is the danger when you just rely on one source or one area for your information. And, it's frightening to think that there are about 50 million Americans who think the election has been stolen. And, we saw the reaction at the Capitol when the rioting started, and it was quite shocking.
Yeah. Very shocking. That was really cool. That was very interesting. Thank you so much. I'm now going to put people into breakout rooms. In each breakout room, there's a different sort of talking point around fake news. So if you could nominate one person to feedback when we all come back into this room, that would be smashing. Really hope this works. Please work. You should all be redirected. All right, it says the rooms are opening. Does take a minute or two to pop everyone in.
Hello.
We're back.
Hi.
Yes, that works. Yeah. So nervous with this technology today, I can't even tell you. Right, so room number 1 was Marion and Vince, and Liz. Who's feeding back?
Well, I will say, Janine, we didn't have a question, and Vince wasn't there. So Marion and I had a good old chat, and we were saying about how on our phones the news feeds get pushed through to you, and some of those are not always they're sort of perhaps over sensationalized because they come from other sources. So although you may have a choice of app to use that's a news sort of room that you want to see, sometimes because of the pushing coming through, it leaves you without much choice. That's what we spoke about because we didn't have a question.
Did you check the chat?
Sorry?
Did you check
the chat? There's nothing in the chat. And I
did check the chat. Yeah, there wasn't anything in there.
Oh dear. It was going to go wrong some way today, wasn't it? Let's face it.
You can throw us the question that we were meant to have. If you like.
So the question that you were supposed to see was, what strategies have you seen people use to make fake news seem true?
Oh,
yeah,
I bet you wish you hadn't asked now, don't you?
Yeah.
I
would say, like referencing somebody, referencing someone who hasn't actually said something. Yeah, to use a famous institution or person's name to endorse something when they haven't actually said it. Yeah, obviously that. I know that one was given, so it's a bit of a cheat, but
I think
like the article looks like it's from a reputable newspaper, but if you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that it's not actually. It's just something they've made it look quite similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's that formatting of it, isn't it? If it looks or if it looks very professional, it's got the pictures in it, it's written well, it's you're more perhaps on board to take it as a correct or an accurate piece of news, but yeah.
And also look around what else is on that page as well, because sometimes if you get some ridiculous things popping up around it, apps and adverts and ridiculous stories, I sort of tend to feel that it has less credibility.
Yeah.
Look at the date as well of when it was published. I've noticed that. I've looked at that a lot of times where people will say something, but actually it's an article that was published 12 months ago or 6 months ago or something.
Yeah. So that brings me on to room 2, which was Dan and Darren. So hopefully you saw your question, but for the rest of the group, it was what topics seem to be the focus of fake news?
So it looks like I'm feeding back because Dan's had to escape to go to nursery. But the question was around what sort of topics do you see around in fake news? And I guess our responses are quite limited because I don't watch or read a lot of news. And if I do, it's generally the BBC or CNN. And if I'm honest, I only watch CNN for the comedy factor of Trump. But I think if I do see fake news, I think for me, it's more around politics. Well, that's global politics, not just UK.
Yeah. So room number 3, which was Joe's room, you guys had a discussion around what kind of details tend to be included in fake news.
Yeah, so it was just me and Matt, wasn't it, Matt? We had a nice chat. So we talked about the use of statistics. So, you know, if I say to you 62% of people said this, you would think I've done some research and there would be some evidence and you probably wouldn't question it. You might ask what kind of population I use, but probably that's about it. We talked about emotive language. So if you talk about Trump and the election and it being stolen and they're thieves, and they're words that will generate a response in us, because you can only imagine the injustice we would feel if someone stole something from us. So you kind of go, oh, you know, it gets people fired up. We talked about the use of images, the physical use of imagery, but also the descriptive narratives that conjure up imagery. So, you know, thieves, you know, they're bad people. So, you know, and how the stories are really quite embellished and sort of larger than life. So they're, you know, the language is not always suitable for what he's talking about. You wouldn't, you know, associate losing an election to theft and thieves and being stolen. So that whole sort of the drama around it as well. That's what we came on.
We would also like to know who owns the cockerel.
Yeah. We won't say about that conversation, but we thought that was quite amusing. I did anyway.
Oh, was that a cockerel that you heard?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, that's mine.
right now.
Oh, brilliant. Right, room number 4 was Nicola's room. You guys had the question around what kind of details tend to be left out of fake news.
Do you want me to go, Louise or Nick, or do you want to go? I'll go. So it was mainly like some sources are often left out. So we talked about sources are often left out. A contrasting opinion is always sort of left out. It's left out of a lot of news stories, though, isn't it? But it's kind of there's never. It's always one side. There's always it's them against us. You never hear the other side, do you? And then, as I mentioned before, we talked about it's that kind of the hide those information, like the dates of when it was published and the real fact-checking sort of information. That's normally how. In fact, BBC have started doing it now, haven't they? They've got that fact-checking service, which I always look at and read that. But yeah, they always seem to hide that actual information, where it's from and how old it is, and kind of the key information that you need on those influential information.
I think the fact-checking thing is quite a good sign. It's something that the American media started doing because of all the lies that were coming out of the Oval Office during the Trump years. And it became popular. One of you mentioned before about CNN. I mean, I became hooked on CNN during the final weeks of Trump because it was so entertaining. But CNN actually overtook the BBC in terms of viewing figures in Britain and became the largest news source in Britain over the BBC, which was a sad indictment on the BBC. But I think in response, the BBC is now not being as complacent and is introducing things like fact checking, which is reassuring, and it's a move in the right direction.
Right, so room number 5, Tim, you were going to feed back. We were talking about what kind of audiences tend to be more susceptible to falling for fake news.
Yeah, so we didn't really come up with a definitive answer to that. We had a conversation around what's and whys, and Olivia spoke a little bit about the experiences of fake news at secondary school, and we discussed, is it that unless you've been personally affected by fake news, you're less likely to be critical of the news that you're listening? So do you have a personal experience and therefore you become critical? But equally, thinking back to when I was at school, I still think when we were told things, you'd call your mates out if you heard something you thought was nonsense, or and then we went as basic as, when you're talking audiences, is it male versus female? Are males more likely to be influenced by fake news or are females? As I say, we didn't necessarily come to a conclusion on that. It was just, how do you break down the audience demographic and understand who's most likely to be susceptible to this type of stuff?
Yeah, and finally we've got room number 6, Travis's room. You may have noticed, everyone, Travis Hornsby, he is my brother. So he's feeding back from that one.
I'm quite happy too. So I was quite lucky to have everyone in the room. Got quite excited, and we had a conversation on a completely different topic around like the good and the bad in media, and our need to sort of assign the goodie and the baddie and have a hero and a villain. So that was quite interesting. But then we did get onto the actual question, which is around the history, impact through history. And I'd read something recently that's quite interesting to get Yvonne's opinion on, which is the repetition of sources of fake news through history. So there was a book I read an article on, I'm going to check it, it's quite a long title, Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's been used throughout the Holocaust. It's been referenced by Gaddafi and several others. And it's almost, the way I kind of understand it is there's like almost a structure to writing fake news and a repeated pattern that comes sometimes, especially around the conspiracy side of things. So yeah, thanks for putting me in that room. I got a bit excited and a bit nerdy.
Well, no, it was fascinating. I nearly mentioned the protocols as part of my speech, and then I just thought it's quite complicated to go into. But the fact that in the 21st century there are still people, large numbers of people, who think that this is a genuine book and that it is authentic is really frightening, especially when you realise that sort of propaganda, which was an infodemic in the 1930s, led to the Holocaust and the deaths of 6 million people. So, we can't be complacent about fake news, and we need to call it out wherever it is.
I think that's a really good place to sort of wrap up and end. Thank you so much, Yvonne. That was amazing. Really interesting.
Well, thank you for the questions. That was great fun, and I hope you'll invite me back again, because I've really enjoyed the session today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking me, Janine.
Yeah, no, I'm very, very pleased that we were able to do this. I'm just going to hand over to Nicola quickly, because she's going to just briefly introduce who we're going to have as our next guest HiveMinds speaker on the 5th of March.
So we have creative director Adam Hunt, who is from White Label Comedies, He'll be joining us to talk about the humour in social media marketing and how it's essential to build a human connection with an audience, and also why it's effective to drive engagement on social media. He'll also give us a peek inside the normally top secret process of white label comedy used to break down a brand and its audience to find how to write brand safe jokes. He'll also teach us simple techniques to anyone who wants to write them, and show how you can make the process even easier. So he will share fill in the blank templates with Brands Against Mundanity, which is a creative card game that allows you to write your brand's social post for you. So anyone who attends will have the option to claim a free downloadable copy of Brands Against Mundanity, and this is probably one I'm really excited about.
Thanks very much. Right, I have put the link to Yvonne's book in the chat. Please do check it out. It is fantastic, and follow us on socials to find out updates for the next HiveMind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant.
Thank you
very
very
much.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you.